Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this Dymocks event. What an amazing program or project Chapter 1 is. So excited. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so grateful to Sue Bobbermain and Timothy Snedden for getting this project up. So many authors bringing out books during this time. It's such a challenge, and this is the best answer to it that I've been happy to be part of. I want to spend a moment just acknowledging the original custodians of this land. I am sitting on Wurundjeri Wirrum country of the Kulin Nation. I would like you to take a moment to think of the original custodians of the land on which you're sitting. And I want to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and thank them so much for being the custodians of this land and doing that, performing that stewardship so well for the 60,000 plus years before we arrived. I want to take this little moment to also say I don't think we have been very good custodians of this land, nor have we shown the kind of grace and tolerance that our Indigenous people have shown towards boat people for the last 200 odd years. All that said, what I'm going to do tonight is spend a little bit of time talking about my book, of course, and then opening up for questions. I'm really interested in having a conversation with you and hoping that you have questions already or might jot some down as I speak and we can get into a good conversation. I hope that you've all got the drink of your choice. I have bought for this occasion a very special single malt Japanese whiskey. Yes, and I have it in a glass that this is mirroring and I can't tell which way to show you this, but this glass I procured in my youth at a bar where I was dared to pop it into my bag and walk off with it. So I still have it. It must be about 30 years old. So here's to us and here's to all of you and here's to Spinsters. So I wrote this book because, well, I wrote the first version of it when I was in my 40s. And it was a terrible version. It was a horrible social sort of pop sociology book that was trying to tease out some of the issues around being single, and it was going to be a rather plain, sort of bloodless book. And as I got to the end of that text, I was beginning to feel very frightened about going forward. I was tripping over something I didn't like. And so I put it in a cupboard. And recently, maybe 3 years ago, it became clear to me that increasingly young men and women in their late 30s and early 40s were finding themselves uncoupled and very likely not to have children. And that through no choice of their own. Some people were choosing it, some people are choosing it. But those people who weren't choosing it, I could see, were very confused about what was going on. And I remember that at the time, when I was going through that, there wasn't very much useful literature on how to live this life. There were a few books that I found that were useful, but in the main, they were kind of joke books about 365 ways that it's better to be single or married or vice versa, and the kind of books that people got together just to make a bit of money, it struck me. And then there was a body of research, which I did sort of almost drown in, I have to say. It was research that was looking at whether or not people are happier, healthier and wealthier if they are married or if they're single. And I was left with some really aching questions, I have to say. I was reading that it depended on who was running the research, to be honest, but mostly it was the research was suggesting, which it started in the wake of the sexual and feminist revolution, and since marriage was just breaking down and people were finding new ways to live their lives, there was a group of people who wanted to research what it would be like if people didn't formally marry. And so what they did was they compared and contrasted married people, who could also include de facto people in de facto relationships, or people who were couples without children. But there was generally that kind of traditional family grouping, compared to everything that's single. Everything that's single includes bachelors and bachelorettes, women who are choosing to have children on their own, separated and divorced people, and widows. Sometimes it included, I still cannot believe that I read this in a serious academic research, it included clergy, even though they've chosen that life and gone in a completely different way. And sometimes, curiously, the studies included mistresses and prostitutes, which is probably something to think about, but a very different kind of life. So I was concerned that this social research was comparing apples with oranges, if you like, two completely different groups. And then they were trying to make some conclusions about which group was happier and healthier and wealthier. And I read all this stuff and I just thought to myself, well, even if I would be happier coupled with children, it takes the participation, the enthusiastic participation of another person to do that. So it's not like you can just go out and buy a partner, set up a family. So I wondered what the purpose of this research was. And of course, I realised that it was a kind of comeback to the sexual revolution, the feminist revolution, and the disintegration of marriage. The other thing that I observed about this research was that there was no blind study done. Now, we all know what a blind study is these days because we're very interested in blind studies being done for the vaccine for COVID-19. And what that means is that a random group of people will be given the placebo drug, and another random group of people will be given the actual drug, and no one will know the difference until the end of the research and see whether it's reacted or not. One should do this when comparing and contrasting the happiness, the wealth and health of two groups. One should get that group into a room and randomly select the people who will be married for the rest of their lives and the people who will remain single for the rest of their lives. Clearly, it's not possible to do that. And so I was beginning to think that there was something blinding these researchers, because this is Research 101. It was blinding these researchers, and I was very concerned. And I thought to myself, maybe there's something else going on. I'm missing out something here. There's a bundle of research on this issue that's been done, and I can't find it. Now, it so happens I was part of a writing class, and I'm now going to read to you. While I'm reading, you can think of a question if you haven't thought of one already. But I'm just going to read to you what happened to me when I took my research, my paper, to a writing class, because I was getting a little concerned about what I was finding out. This is where it begins here. You're talking about prejudice, you know. There it was, the truth of it. The woman who said it was taller than me, older, tanned, with blonde wisps. She wore bluntstones, lived on an outback station with her husband. She had been German once. In fact, if it wasn't for her accent, she could have been straight out of We of the Never Never. And perhaps she was. I got the impression she loved her land and could never rest away from it. The Never Never woman and I were members of a masterclass in writing. That day, I presented the essence of the book I wanted to write. What is it like to be single? I hoped someone might tell me there was an entire Australian literature on single life that distinguished between the uncoupled and childless and everybody else. The Never Never woman said hardly anything in class, so I assumed she was a fierce feminist. After class, I walked fast past the plane trees in the courtyard to avoid the swooping magpies, but she caught me up. So there we were, the Never Never woman, standing slightly too close and me dodging the magpies diving at my silver hair. I clipped it up. She stepped in closer and said, "Their unconscious bias blinds them. Making lives invisible is the first stage of prejudice." I kind of knew this in my soul and I did not want to know. I wrote the word prejudice across my manila folder. It was the first and last time I ever saw the Never Never woman, but I now saw prejudice everywhere. Like a matrix, prejudice is an intercellular substance weaving in and out of everyone and everything we do. Like Morpheus, it sends phantoms to fool data collectors, social scientists, and warriors for women's rights. It tricks ordinary people into insulting, diminishing, and dismissing the ones they love. All the shoddy data, all this rudderless invisibility translates into a remarkable lack of public policy and a palpable disrespect for men and women who are fated not to find the kind of love required to make a family. Prejudice, that icy word, crystal sharp, shot through with inclusions of envy, fear, and hatred, forged in an eternity of righteous morality. A subtle prejudice, such a subtle difference. Spinsterhood, bachelorhood, such a first world problem. What easy victims we childless never marrieds are. No need for ghettos, concentration camps or gulags. We are disappeared in plain sight. Invisibles, working at our desks, walking the streets, sitting in cafes, taking in entertainments, paying our taxes without family concessions and deductions or tax minimisation entities. Invisibles who risk derision if we dare say what it is like to be single. So there you have it. I came into this book as a single woman and I left a spinster because I realised that in all the many ways one could be single, there was very, very little written on how to be a spinster. And there was even less written on what it is to be a man of a certain age without children and uncoupled. We don't even have a word for that. We could call him confirmed bachelor, but that has all sorts of other implications to it. So we need a word for that. The other thing that I went into this book with was a sense of privilege, education, a bit untouchable. And I came out, well, I went in a bit burdened, I'd say. I didn't know what the burden was, but when the Never Never woman said it was prejudice, it was exhilarating. It was as if it lifted off me and I knew what it was and I could do something about it. Okay, well, that's about everything I've got to say to introduce the evening, and I'm wondering what your questions are. And is there one? I think Timothy behind the screen will, I'm just looking at some comments here to see if there's a question. Here we are. How has feminism influenced my life? Well, you can see that feminism obviously influenced the way I was looking at that research, but feminism came to me young. I was in high school. It was the last year of my school life, and Germaine Greer was in Australia and she was being interviewed on 7:30, I think, or I can't remember the name of the show, but it was the news show that came after the news, which we call 7:30 these days. And she was telling me about women's liberation and the idea that a woman could have what a woman wanted to have, and she needed to make a balance, and she needed to make some very good decisions about her life, and she didn't have to marry if she didn't want to, and she could take the pill and not have children if she didn't want to. And so it hit me like a thunderbolt, the idea of equality and respect for women. And I assumed, given the revolution that I was living through, that this would change forever. So that's how feminism has influenced my life. It was people like Germaine Greer, also women like Anne Summers, who wrote Damned Whores and God's Police, an amazing book that really opened my eyes into the way in which everyday interactions were so important to maintain one's respect and one's dignity, and also gently remind everyone that we are equal. How is being a spinster different from being single? Well, I see single as being the overarching kind of category. Um, Single is everything that is not married or not coupled, not in a de facto relationship. And so spinster is a very clear category to me because it is it's the situation a woman like me finds herself where uh, there's not been a significant relationship um, that's been something that could happen for the duration. It doesn't mean that you haven't lived with someone. You might have lived with someone for a couple of years, but it didn't turn into a permanent relationship and involve children and family making. So that is how spinster is being different to, say, a single mum or a divorced and separated person who has children, and the debt that comes with the debt that comes with divorce. And it's certainly very different to being a widow. One of the things that a spinster doesn't have is the tattoos of initiation into society. These days, it used to be that marriage was a real tattoo into society. You got your kind of mark of respect and you were seen as a grown up. Um, and then parenthood would be the next one. So those are the two main tattoos. During the 60s and 70s, when marriage was questioned, it was more, the tattoo was more about coupling. But the biggest tattoo of all is the one about having children. And women in particular who don't have children for whatever reason are really denigrated as not having the capacity to love in the fullness and the way in which a mother loves. And this, in Australia in particular, is the primary, the top, the most applauded kind of love a person can express. And we don't even notice that we believe this, and we don't even notice that that belief about love influences all sorts of decisions. I remember in particular, I think it was Warren Inch, one of the politicians in the Gillard government, actually criticised Julia Gillard for not having children because she would never know the greatest love of all. That was what he said. Now, I'm pretty sure that was Warren Inch, but I could be wrong. But you can see how subtle it is that we just, if a woman hasn't had a child, then she's seen to be inadequate in her capacity for love. Ah, I guess, let me think. So the question for everyone is, what's something we should avoid asking or saying to a spinster? Well, why didn't you have children? Why didn't you get married? Did you choose your career over marriage? That sort of assumption, it just really irks me. I think those sorts of assumptions that I remember also a moment where I was on Lord Howe Island, and there's a little beach there where you can go and hand feed the fish. And there's a particular time during the day, and I was there with a bundle of people, and we were hand feeding the fish. And I was talking to this woman, and we were having a great time. And I noticed that out on the coral reef, her son was he was struggling. I couldn't quite tell what it was that was happening, but I was just alert to his struggle. And I said to her, "I think your son's in trouble." And she turned around and said, "What would you know? You haven't had children." So that's really something not to say to a spinster. And I think, when I've told that story again, I've had women say to me, and women in particular have said to me, "Well, I think you're being a bit sensitive." But I'm not being sensitive. I'm just pointing out the unnecessary, the unthought through, hurtful things that people can say. I would never say to anyone that they didn't know anything about children if they hadn't had children. Especially if they're pointing out to me that my son is struggling on a coral reef. So there are a few things. Hi, Donna. Hi, Renee. I'm wondering what role art has had in giving you comfort. Um, I don't think art gives me comfort. I think art inspires me. I think certainly inspires me in the way I write. There's certain, not visual art, but music and literature really does inspire the way I write. But it doesn't give me comfort. I think food gives me comfort. I think blankets and cozy evenings with good friends asking interesting questions gives me comfort. Um, I don't think these things do give me comfort. A good Japanese whiskey gives me comfort. Um, but art gets me thinking. Art gets me alive. Art gets me wondering what that artist was trying to say to me. Art gets me excited to go and write something, create something myself. So I'm sorry, it doesn't give me comfort. In fact, it's the last thing it gives me now that I think of it. It's sort of, yes, it gives me a hurdle to jump. Is there another question? Karen Donnellian. Would you agree there's a sense of exclusion and discrimination for single childless women in their 50s? Yes, I think in the 50s you really feel it. I felt it also in the 40s and in the 30s. If you Once all my friends were having children, um, I certainly wasn't invited to many gatherings because my friends' lives went in a different direction. Once you've had children, life gets formulated around it. So the entire weekend is about, you know, footy practice with the children or trivia nights or quiz nights or I don't know what, because I haven't been involved in it. And at that level, I felt a sense of exclusion. It kind of deepened around 50 and 60, I have to say. The exclusion, it deepened, but I guess I feel like it was, I was getting used to it as well. So I was kind of getting numb to it. But, and I was accepting life the way it is for me, which is lots and lots of time on the weekends. I never expect a friend to spontaneously ring me on the weekend. They'll spontaneously ring me during the week, and we'll catch up during the weekday or at weeknights. But when the family's around, people invest in that as they should, and so that sense of exclusion came in. I did notice around 50, I have to say, that men flirted less with me. It wasn't a great tragedy for me, but I did notice that more uh, than when I was younger. And now when I'm 60, I don't feel so excluded because, in a way, I'm kind of more acceptable. Uh, People assume that I was once married and that I've got grown up children. And so I can have a conversation. I'm more engaged. They engage with me more, and I can have a conversation around it. And then I can introduce them to the fact that I have never partnered or had children, and I'm still an okay person because they clearly have been talking to me for about half an hour. Hi, Amanda. Oh, I'm glad you're loving the book. He breathes. Okay, I'll read Amanda's note. Loving the book, so validating. When I picked it up, I breathed a sigh of relief and thought, finally, could you please talk a bit about you, how you respond to things like it'll happen to you, oh yeah, it will happen for you, don't worry. It's such a difficult little moment because I want it to happen. I mean, now I'm much more relaxed about it, but back in the day, I wanted it to happen. So I wanted so much to um, believe what my friends would say. But coming to terms with the fact that it was a mythology, that we say that because we love our friends and we want the best for them and we want them to have what they want. Um, I think it's really hard. It was really hard. I did get a little cynical. I felt the cynicism sneaking in my 40s when I was a bit irritated. I wanted to say no. I need the conversation that's about when it doesn't happen. But I realised that all the friends I was talking with about this didn't have an answer. Because there is no answer. Well, hopefully my book provides a bit of an answer, but there is no answer in many ways for any part of life. Life is what it is. Some of us fall in love and get married and have children, or couple up and have children. Some of us don't. Some of us have children on our own. Some of us don't. Some of us don't ever couple up and have children. Some of us, our loved ones, die before their time. And I think that the big thing that I had to come to terms with was the fact that no one has the answers. No one has any answer really except you about how you live the life at hand. And that is what is most amazing and terrifying about being alive. Holden, how are you? Donna, you've been an editor and a publisher for many years and a brilliant one. Well, thank you kindly, sir. How did this experience influence either the way you write or the way you approached the release of your book? Ah, now there's a big question. How did it influence the way I write? Oh, look, publishing and editing is just absolutely the best way to hone your own writing skills, in my opinion. I don't know what others would say, but I really learned how to write a sentence through editing other people. Um, and I really learned about engaging the reader, uh, getting a punchline. And I don't mean a joke. I mean that line that really, the person's reading, chugging along, reading, and then that line, that one sentence that you've written everything before it to get to, where the person goes, oh, that little moment. So editing other people's work and then applying that editing to my own writing was just the best training ever. And on the release of the book, well, I think you know what happened. On the release of the book, we had a big launch up at Readings Bookshop in Carlton, and there was there was about 90 people there, and there was this moment where it was so organic. I just felt the size of the crowd was at that optimal moment where you begin proceedings, and I literally walked up to the microphone as if I was the publisher and took it to welcome everyone. And Bernard Kaleo, who was the host of the evening, dived in from God knows where and ripped that microphone out of my hand and took me behind the bookcases and said, Donna, tonight you are the talent, and you are, you're not the host, you're the talent. And then my good friend George Dumford from Arts Hub came around, and I was laughing and kind of totally discombobulated, to be honest. And he just said to me exactly what I needed to hear and everything I knew. He said, everyone is here to listen to you, and they are rooting for you, and you'll get your cue for coming on stage. So that was a big thing, but it was a really good moment for me to be reminded about how easy it is to slip between roles when you're familiar with both sides of the line. I've been quite good in the I think I'd been quite good. Maybe my publisher would say something different, but I feel like I was quite good in all the process of getting the manuscript together, all the editing. I loved the editing. The editing process with Alan and Unwin was just superb, and the copy editing and then the cover design, I tried to let that be all the publisher's work. But when push came to shove on the night of the launch, I was in control and needed to be contained. Do we have any other questions, or is this what am I working on next? Renee, thank you. Renee, I am working on I think I have to say that because everything starts out to be one thing and turns into something else. But at the moment, I'm working on something that's the same but different. It's a book. The title is Notebook from the End of Time. And I want to track the experience of aging with this time that we're living in, which feels like end times in so many ways. So I'm very curious about the fact that I'm edging into the last years of my life. Theoretically, I'm not saying anything there, but theoretically, I'm looking at aging. I'm looking at disintegration. That's what I'm managing. And here we are in a world that's facing a time that just feels so apocalyptic, and it fascinates me to be thinking about that on a global level and a societal level and a personal level at the same time. So that's what I'm doing at the moment, and fingers crossed that's what it ends up to be. Maybe it'll be something else. That's how it goes. So we've got time for one last question, if anyone's got one. Keep writing, Donna. Oh, thank you very much, Renee. That's sweet of you to say. Thank you. Thank you. Sue, hi. Sue, it's been great hearing about your research practice. Can you tell us what inspired you to write your book? Well, it was a dark and stormy night, and I had tripped over a dog. That day I had tripped over a dog that was tied to a trestle table full of books. And when I tripped over, this book fell onto the ground, and it was called, it was a book about being single. I can't remember the title now. But I just thought it was a curse and threw it back on the table and limped home. And I was making soup for myself that night, and I was sitting in the chair eating it, and I thought, I've got to go back and get that book. And so I went back and got that book, and I read it. And as I read it, I was really aware of how American it was and how my life was very different. It was about single women, and I was also aware of the fact that it seemed as if feminism had passed this subject by and passed these women by. None of them were talking about the fact that they had divorced or were choosing to be single parents because of feminism. And there was a subtle tone in the book that was suggesting that women who are not married and settled down having families are upset about the fact because the only myth that they have to make meaning and purpose of their lives is the one where you fall in love and you walk into the sunset happily ever after. And I just didn't buy it. I just thought, how could you get through the 60s and 70s without noticing Germaine Greer, without noticing Jane Fonda sitting on a gun in the middle of the Vietnam protests, without being frightened by Sigourney Weaver fighting aliens, an alien mother, by the way. I just didn't buy it. And in that moment, it occurred to me that I perhaps could write my version. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been an absolute delight to be here. And again, please, from me and from everybody, I'm sure, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Sue, for making this event happen. It's been spectacular and a really lovely evening. Thank you. Good night. Drink your